And welcome to our second Ryan Center public lecture of the spring semester 2025. My name is Brian Satterfield. I am the director of the Ryan Center. The Matthew J. Ryan Center promotes inquiry into the principles and processes of free government and seeks to advance understanding of the responsibilities of public servants and citizens of constitutional democratic societies. As I mentioned, this is the second event this semester. We have one more coming up, which I will advertise to you. The title of that public lecture is A North Korean Defector's Search for Freedom in America. It is a public talk with Yeonmi Park, who will share her story as a defector from North Korea, as well as her concerns for free speech in America today. That is on Thursday, April 10th, if you are interested. Today, I should mention, is our Elizabeth and Jay McAndrews lecture on American political ideas. Jay and Elizabeth are generous supporters of the Ryan Center and have given an endowment to allow this lecture. We are very grateful for their support. Today's speaker is Dr. Christopher J. Kelly, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Boston College and one of America's leading scholars of Rousseau. Professor Kelly has written extensively on Rousseau, with such books as Rousseau as author, Consecrating One's Life to the Truth, Rousseau's Exemplary Life, The Confessions as Political Philosophy, and numerous articles. He is, in addition, the editor of the collected writings of Rousseau, which is now, I think, the standard work in English, or the standard publication or edition of Rousseau in English. He is going to be speaking to us today about Rousseau's Revolution, and that is Rousseau's account of the upheavals that he foresaw coming in the very near future in his lifetime, and also how he hoped to shape them through his own engagement. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kelly.
Thank you very much, Dr. Satterfield, and I'd like to thank the McAndrews and the Ryan Center for the invitation to come here. I've retired a couple of years ago from Boston College and could have moved anywhere in the world and decided to come to Philadelphia. And it's great for me to have an opportunity to get to know people in this intellectual community. And I hope this begins a long relationship with people at Villanova. So I'm aware that for many of the people in the audience, the students, Rousseau is, or at least as of a couple of weeks ago, was just a name that you'd heard. An author who you knew that someday you might have to read. And for some of you, that's come true. You are reading Rousseau, I understand. So to me, you might think that he was just the name of an author who's famous, who you have to read. But my goal in the lecture today is to get you interested in Rousseau and think that he might be someone well worth reading. My specific theme, as Dr. Satterfield mentioned, is Rousseau and revolution. Historically, this is a very common theme. There are even books called Rousseau and Revolution, more than one of them. Many people who know nothing else about Rousseau connect him with the French Revolution and tend to blame him for the excesses of the French Revolution. And there are even people who blame him for the excesses of the revolutions that came afterwards. I'm going to try to show that whatever might be true about these cases, about Rousseau's relation with these specific revolutions, Rousseau considered himself a revolutionary in a different and surprising sense. His thoughts about revolution include, but go beyond, political revolution. He's concerned with what one scholar called a revolution in our daily life. He's concerned with a sort of revolution that it encompasses our understanding of things such as love and family, our relations to our fellow human beings in general, and personal independence. In all of these things, he's a revolutionary or thought of himself as one. So before tackling this large question of these big themes, because most of you are not terribly familiar with Rousseau, I'd like to begin by giving a short account of his life and career as a writer. And I think it's an interesting story in itself and does set the stage for what I'll have to say later. Rousseau was born in 1712 in Geneva, which is now part of Switzerland, but then was an independent city. To give some perspective on Geneva in the 18th century, it had about 2/3 of the population that Radnor, Pennsylvania has today. It was not a large city. It was in a much smaller area than Radnor, Pennsylvania is today. So small both in population and in size. But it was a city that was bustling with productive and commercial activity. A lot of trade went through Geneva, and they made watches that were exported around the world. In fact, Rousseau's father had been recruited to go to Turkey to live in Istanbul and make watches for the members of the harem of the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. He returned after several years, and that's when Rousseau was born. So Rousseau was born in this community, which was a Calvinist community. His mother died a few days after giving birth to him. And when Jean-Jacques was 10 years old, his father had to leave town because of trouble with the law. So he found himself sort of an orphan. He was taken into the care of an uncle, and right away was sent out to the country. Within a month or so, was sent out to the country to live with and be tutored by a Protestant minister. He stayed there for 2 years, which is essentially the only period in which he had what could be called formal education, a personal tutor. So he went to school for 2 years. That's all. He was not a college graduate or even a high school graduate. Maybe he could be considered a middle school graduate at the end of his schooling. He returned to his uncle's home and eventually was apprenticed to an engraver when he was about to turn 13 years old. The apprenticeship was supposed to last for 5 years, at which point Rousseau would have been capable of earning his living as a journeyman engraver. In short, he would have reached the age of a high school graduate today, trained in a skill that would have allowed him to lead a moderately comfortable life. But instead of completing his apprenticeship, he ran away from Geneva halfway through. By the time he turned 16, he had crossed the Alps and was living in Turin, now part of Italy, but then the capital of the Kingdom of Savoy, without enough skill to earn his living, barely understanding the language that most people spoke. He spoke French, they spoke Italian. For some of the time, he was homeless, and he escaped several attempts to molest him. I think it would be safe to say that this was not a promising beginning for his life, and that few of you would have wanted to change places with him when you were the same age. For the next 20 years, he wandered around Western Europe, living in the Kingdom of Savoy, Switzerland, Lyon, France, Paris, and Venice. He was employed as a servant in a couple of noble households, entered a seminary for a couple of months, studied and taught music, although most of his students knew music better than he did when he started teaching. He had to practice to stay just ahead of them. He worked as a translator for a Greek con man. He got a job as a surveyor's secretary. All of this by the time he was 19 years old. Now, this might have been an impressive resume if it were not for the case that he never lasted for as long as a year in any of these positions. So he had a very eventful life, but no accomplishments to speak of. He eventually was able to settle down in one place for several years and dedicated himself to studying under his own guidance while teaching music a little. His studying was extremely rigorous. He gives us a schedule of his reading and how he spent every day, but he was self-taught. The knowledge that he acquired in his studies eventually allowed him to get a position as a tutor. He lasted 13 months in that job, which for him was a record. Finally, at the age of 30, so he's 30 years old with nothing to show for his life, which his father regularly reminded him of, he went to live in Paris, full of hopes for fame and fortune as a musician, or a playwright if that didn't work out, or a chess player if that didn't work out, or almost anything else. A bright young man for the provinces who goes to the big city hoping to make it big. He was surprised to learn that neither fame nor fortune gave very quickly to someone with his talents and resume. Paris was not a welcoming place. He made a little bit of money teaching music, spent a lot of his time going to the theater, concerts, and playing chess at coffee houses. If I were giving this lecture 15 years ago, I would say he was a slacker, a term which may still mean something to some of you, some of the older people in the audience at least. Right? So he's in his 30s and spends all his time at the coffee house and going to the theater. He also wrote about music and composed some. Eventually, he was offered a position as secretary to the French ambassador to Venice. So he went to Venice. Within a few months, he quarreled with the ambassador, and there's some dispute over whether he quit or was fired. But again, he lasted less than a year in that job, went back to Paris. He got a position as a sort of research assistant for a wealthy family that had intellectual ambitions. This time, he managed to hold on to his position for several years, reading books on chemistry, economics, and history for his employers who wanted to write books on these subjects, or actually wanted to publish books with their names on them, but they wanted someone else to write the book for them. And he still went to plays, operas, and coffee houses. He was enjoying himself, although still making much less money than he would have made if he had stayed in Geneva and finished his apprenticeship and been an engraver. At this point, Rousseau is now 37 years old. And it would be hard to distinguish him from any number of young or not so young men who had sworn to Paris from the provinces. He had a job that didn't pay very much. He's published a few things to which no one has paid much attention. And he'd made friends with some other young or not so young men and women who were beginning to make their way as intellectuals. In those days, aspiring writers ran risks, and Rousseau's best friend found himself in jail because one of his books offended important people. After several weeks in prison, this friend was allowed visitors. And so every afternoon, he worked in the morning, every afternoon Rousseau walked 4 miles, he couldn't afford a carriage, to visit his friend in prison. And because the weather was hot, he would stop halfway through the walk, sit under a tree, and read for a while. One day, his reading consisted of an announcement of an essay contest on this topic. Has the restoration of the sciences and arts tended to purify morals? Write an essay on this, and you get a gold medal as a prize if you win. Rousseau later said that immediately upon reading this, he said, I saw another universe and I became another man. Thinking about this topic caused a radical change in him and set him on the path that made him famous. Rousseau's thoughts about revolution begin with what he calls a sudden internal revolution in his own thoughts. Now, before describing exactly how this essay topic brought about this change, this revolution in him, I'd like to give a brief account of the results of the change to show you how momentous it was for Rousseau and for many other people. The first result is that he wrote an essay, sent it in, won the prize, and published the essay in early 1751. So he's not quite 39 at this point. The publicity around this essay made him famous very quickly, famous throughout Europe. While he continued to write on this subject, mainly to respond to critics, he also composed an opera. Remember, he'd been teaching music. And it became the most popular French opera of the 18th century. He also engaged in a controversy over the relative merits of French and Italian music. In the midst of his Parisian success, he gave up life in high society and moved to the country, but he didn't stop writing. He published a number of small works, each of them successful, and wrote a novel, which became so successful that it went through almost 200 editions in the next 25 years. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies at a time in which not everyone knew how to read. Just to make a comparison, imagine what it would be like for someone to write, in less than a decade, several important works of political philosophy, a smash hit musical, and an all-time best-selling novel. For example, imagine if in addition to writing Hamilton, Lin-Manuel Miranda also wrote Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, and also published extremely important works of political theory and public policy. That would be Rousseau. So from being a nobody when he was 37, he went to this within 10 years. All because of what happened to him under the tree. I should mention that the story doesn't stop there. About 10 years after publishing his Discourse on the Sciences and the Arts, Rousseau finished two books, one called Emile, or On Education, and the other on the Social Contract, perhaps a book you've heard of. Upon their publication, these works caused an enormous controversy, and Rousseau was in effect banished from France. He was awakened in the middle of the night and told if he set out to leave the country, then they would let him go, but if he was there the next day, they would arrest him. And then he was exiled from other places. And the two books were burned by the public hangman in a number of cities. Right? They wouldn't have just anyone sully himself by burning books. They had the hangman do it. So the controversy and repression that Rousseau experienced did not keep his books from being read. Quite the contrary. They were very widely read, and Rousseau became even more famous as a victim of repression. He did have to move from place to place, watching out for how the authorities and populace would regard his presence, and warrants for his arrest were still active when he died about 15 years later. He didn't stop writing, but in order to stay out of trouble, he did not publish most of the later works during his life. They've been published since. The story of Rousseau's life is a fascinating one, and he tells it in his autobiography, The Confessions. So let's go back to the tree. Rousseau is sitting under the tree on his way to visit his friend who's in prison. What made his sudden and sustained burst of activity possible? How did it happen that he saw another universe and became another man? The first thing I want to mention is that he had in fact been working and thinking very hard for more than 15 years. I talked about his efforts to educate himself. He had been studying for himself and for his employers. Nevertheless, he himself says he was somewhat confused. He was ambitious for success. He wanted to be famous. He wanted to be a celebrity. He loved thinking, and he also wanted to make a contribution to the world. The question is how these things can fit together. Is the desire for success compatible with concern to learn the truth? Or does it lead away from that? Is pursuit of the sciences and the arts compatible with the promotion of morality? Or do those things corrupt people? It's not that he hadn't thought about these issues, but the essay question, again, the question was, has the restoration of the sciences and the arts tended to purify morals? Suddenly focused his attention on them in a new way. He answered, by the way, no, they don't tend to purify morals. Even more, the question caused Rousseau to see these issues in political terms in a way that he hadn't before. He was living in Paris at a time when France was perhaps the most powerful state in Europe, and Paris was, as it still is, the most glamorous city in the world. It has rivals, but let's say that. It was a luxurious city in which artistic activity of all sorts was at a peak. Finally, the intellectual life to which he aspired was made up of reformers who hoped to change the world and to become famous and influential while doing so. How should one understand such a time and such a place? He had been drawn to Paris because of its glamour, its importance, but now he thinks about it differently. The insight that Rousseau gained by contemplating the essay proposal was a complicated one. I want to focus on the political and specifically revolutionary aspect of this insight. But there's even more that is involved in what he called his system of thought. One constant in Rousseau's writings, beginning at this period and continuing through his whole career, was the conviction that the society in which he lived, that had looked so grand to him on the outside, was in fact extraordinarily corrupt and also weak in spite of its apparent grandeur. He says about his experience under the tree, "If I had ever been able to write a quarter of what I saw and felt under the tree, how clearly I would have made all the contradictions of the social system seen, and with what strength I would have exposed all the abuses of our institutions." So contradictions of the social system and abuses of institutions, those are his themes. Within the essay that he wrote right away, after arguing that his society's boasts about its moral superiority deceptively conceal injustice and misery, he says that the basic question is to know whether it is more important for empires to be brilliant and transitory or virtuous and durable. With this statement, he claims not only that brilliance covers vice, but that brilliant states like France are transitory. What this means is that France in 1750 is teetering on the brink of ruin, something that other people didn't think was true at the time. In almost every one of his major works over the next decade, Rousseau repeated this warning. In his discourse on the origin of inequality, which I think some of you are reading right now, written 5 years after the first discourse, he argued that progressive inequality would lead to, he says, an air of apparent concord while spreading the seeds of real division from which troubles and calamities and frequent revolutions would result. 7 years after this, in his book Émile, or On Education, he made his prediction so clearly that no one could miss it. He said, "We are approaching a state of crisis and the age of revolutions. Who can answer for what will become of you then?" To make things even clearer, he added a footnote to this passage, in which he says, "I hold it to be impossible that the great monarchies of Europe still have long to last. All have been brilliant, and every state which is brilliant is on the decline." Finally, 10 years later, more than 20 years after his sudden insight of the internal revolution, he wrote, "I see all the states of Europe rushing to their ruin. Monarchies, republics, all these nations so magnificently instituted, all these fine governments so wisely balanced, fallen into decrepitude, menaced by an impending doom." Now, I could add to these quotations, but I think these give you the idea. He thinks things are in a bad way and are going to get worse. For over 2 decades, he was remarkably consistent in predicting the downfall of the forms of government in the great European states. This is the political horizon in which he wrote all of his important works. This is his discovery. He had come to the conclusion that all of the things that he had admired before were in fact signs of weakness and corruption. What is more, of course, he was right. Just over a decade after his death, the French Revolution began, followed by decades of political unrest and turmoil and the fall of many states throughout Europe. So Rousseau saw something that was real. What can we say then? What we can say is that Rousseau predicted an age of revolutions, and his prediction was correct. There's no question that thinking about revolutions was at the center of his thought. What are we to make of this? One possibility, and this is one that many readers of Rousseau have adopted, is that Rousseau, observing the injustice of current society, strove to bring about the revolutions that followed. Right? If things are bad, we should have a revolution to change them. This view would make Rousseau into something like Lenin, who foresaw the Russian Revolution and worked hard to bring it about. One could even say that that revolution might not have happened without Lenin's efforts. Does this analogy between Rousseau and Lenin hold up? I don't think so. First, although he was a champion of a democratic faction in his native Geneva and relentlessly exposed the injustice of the French monarchy, Rousseau was no direct participant in any revolutionary action, the way Lenin was. Second, Lenin was confident that a revolution in Russia would lead to a better condition, not only in Russia, but for the world. If we look at Rousseau's writings, we find no such expression of confidence. None of the statements I've quoted so far indicate anything more than an extremely turbulent situation is about to occur and that forms of government will change. But not every change is a good change. He urges his readers to think about what will become of them in these circumstances. The closest thing to a statement from Rousseau that the revolutions to come might lead to something good is this one. Once a people has been corrupted, there is no remedy short of some great revolution, almost as much to be feared as the evil it might cure, and which is blameworthy to desire and impossible to foresee. This is not the statement of someone who's actively striving to bring about a revolution. So in short, Rousseau's convinced that a revolution is coming, but he's not at all convinced that it's the sort of great revolution that would lead us to a better condition. Some followers of Rousseau believed that their current condition was bad enough to make the risk of a great revolution worthwhile. Things were so bad they had nothing to lose. But Rousseau himself, I think, had doubts about this. So what is to be done then in the face of the coming revolutions? Rousseau presents at least two possible alternatives. First, in the passage I took from his book on education, he argues that what is important for an individual is to learn to survive the upheaval that is coming. He argues that those who let their happiness rest on being successful in the present social order will succeed only in making themselves vulnerable when that order collapses around them. As he says, the noble become commoners, the rich become poor, the monarch becomes subject. He suggests that his ideal student, in his book on education, will acquire the skills that make him independent, that will allow him to earn his living whatever happens. As it happens, he becomes a carpenter. More job security than a king. I would suggest that Rousseau's book on education is meant to be a sort of survival manual for prospering to the extent possible through the coming turmoil. His student will be educated to have the qualities of mind and body that allow him to be as independent of circumstances as is humanly possible. He's educated to find a way to live without either being dominated by others or having to dominate them. In Rousseau's unfinished sequel to this book on education, his fictional student undergoes various tests to see whether his education is successful. The breakup of his family, he's sold into slavery, and ultimately lives alone on a desert island, far from Europe. He experiences and survives both personal and political turmoil. So that's the first alternative. Personally learn how to live through these difficult circumstances that are coming. His second alternative is more social and less individual. To explain this alternative, which can indicate what Rousseau tries to accomplish in his writings, I want to give an analysis of another person who Rousseau talked about, who found himself in circumstances similar to the ones Rousseau describes. He addressed this case in a letter he wrote in response to a young man who had written to him asking for advice about how to live his life. This itself is a remarkable feature of Rousseau's career. Even or especially during the time he was being persecuted and was effectively an outlaw, young men and women wrote to him about how much reading his books had affected them, and also to ask him for advice. How should they raise their children? Should they join the army or leave the army? Should they read more books or give up reading altogether? Should they become poets or carpenters? How should they get along with their parents when they disagree with them about important matters? People in their 20s wrote to him who had never met him, and he wrote back. So Rousseau's exchange with this particular 24-year-old covered a wide range of topics: religious doubts, materialism versus idealism, the relation between moral virtue and happiness. One interesting part of Rousseau's letter is a comparison of Socrates, whom the young man admired very much, and Jesus, whom the young man admired less. He's a follower of Socrates. Rousseau also admired Socrates, but he also admired Jesus. So he introduces his young correspondent to a new understanding of Jesus, whom he presents in entirely human and political terms. He says that Jesus followed a plan from the time he was 12 years old. Rousseau says his noble project was to raise up his people again, to make it once again a free people and worthy of being so. He began by studying the law of Moses and attempting to re-inspire his listeners with attachment to it. He faced two problems. First, his people had become corrupt. They hadn't ruled themselves for a long time. And second, they were dominated by the Romans. Both of these factors made this fundamentally political project impossible or virtually so. Moreover, to attempt this project would have committed him to a degree of violence that was incompatible with his gentleness. What to do in these circumstances? Rousseau says, in the end, it was only after having seen the impossibility of executing his project that he extended it in his head, and that unable by himself to make a revolution in his people, he wanted to make one through his disciples in the universe. In short, Rousseau argues that Jesus changed a political project directed at one people into a moral and religious project aimed at transcending national borders. This is a daring and perhaps heretical interpretation of Jesus. Rousseau says nothing about the resurrection and so on. But whatever might be the case about Jesus, I think it can help us to understand Rousseau himself. As I've said, he diagnosed Europe as being in the midst of a political crisis, and moreover was pessimistic about whether political revolution could by itself bring about a resolution of that crisis. What I want to suggest is that he undertook to bring about a moral revolution that could have an effect even if the political revolutions he foresaw did not succeed in improving things. I'd like to give a partial account of how Rousseau set out to make this revolution effective through his books and his followers or disciples, and then conclude by laying out some of the parts of the substance of this moral revolution. My goal is not so much to defend Rousseau's revolution as to clarify what it was, although we can discuss its implications in the question session if you'd like. How do Rousseau's books further the revolution in the universe that he set out to cause? I'm struck by two things about his writings, and I've read them all. The first is how often he takes a question set out by other people and then makes it his own. Right? He enters these essay contests, but he always answers a different question than the one he's asked. I suspect he learned how to do this when he was working for other people, particularly the family that wanted him to do their research projects for them. Right? So he had to read things, take thousands of pages of notes. Occasionally you can go on eBay and buy a page of Rousseau's handwriting of notes. Right? So he had to do the work they wanted him to do, and to read the books that would help in their tasks. But in doing this, he also learned something for his own benefit. So he was able to change his assignments into something valuable to him. So his earliest writings that made him famous are a series of essays or discourses in which he addressed questions that were posed by scholarly academies for writing contests. In every case, he changed the question before answering it. He didn't always win. I wouldn't recommend this to students who are taking their final exams. I myself have penalized students who didn't answer the question I asked, but said lots of other things. And I imagine there are other professors in this audience who've done the same. But I admit that thinking about Rousseau's procedure makes me wonder about whether this is a good idea. In each case, he took the question he was asked, showed that it was a bad or even a stupid question, and then revealed a better question lying underneath it, which he undertook to answer. This technique helps his revolution because it starts where the audience is, with the question they're asking, but then shows them that they're framing the issue incorrectly, that they aren't quite asking the right question. He forces the readers to change their perspective on things. Even in the illustrations, and almost all of his books have pictures in them, he taught his readers to see things differently than they had before. This technique is most common in the works he published right away after his internal revolution. In his later writing, Rousseau does something different, a second technique. A part of his analysis of the deep corruption he saw in his society is something that he thought was there almost from the beginning, or had been there for a long time before it started to manifest itself. This is true even at the highest level of thought. Rousseau goes to the great books of the past, the way some of you are right now, but he did it on his own without the help you've been getting, and then tries to set each one of them straight with a book of his own. He rewrites the great books of the past. I can give 3 examples of this, but there are more. The first concerned Plato's Republic, which I imagine some of you have been reading. At the beginning of his own book on education, Rousseau calls the Republic the most beautiful treatise on education ever written. And then he writes his own to be even better. What he does in his book is to rewrite Plato's work, but not simply by agreeing with it and by repeating Plato's arguments. Instead, he uses similar examples to make opposite points, takes the order that Socrates suggests for an education and turns it upside down, and so on. He seems to indicate that Plato, unlike the readers of Rousseau's earlier works, had at least posed the correct questions, but that he hasn't got the answers right. And it will take Rousseau to set him straight. My second example concerns Rousseau's autobiography that I mentioned earlier, called The Confessions. Rousseau is far from the first person to use that title for a book. Right? Students at Villanova should be aware of this. Right? Again, Rousseau read Augustine's Confessions, and he disagreed with it. So he takes some of the themes, some of the most important passages and incidents that Augustine describes from his youth, and gives versions of them in the account of his own youth, and rewrites the lesson from them. So he gives a radically different picture of things such as providence, sin, and grace. Again, Rousseau suggests that Augustine raised important questions that were worth considering, but that he got the answers wrong, and Rousseau had to set things straight. My third example concerns Rousseau's novel that I mentioned that was so popular, called Julie, or the New Eloise. He refers to the new Eloise. That means there was an old Eloise. The old Eloise was a woman who engaged in a romantic relationship with Peter Abelard, one of the most famous theologians of the Middle Ages. The letters exchanged by the two of them are famous love letters of a love story that goes tragically wrong. in part because of her father's objections to their relationship. He was her teacher. His father didn't like him seducing his daughter. Rousseau rewrites this love story in a way that gives much more sympathy for young lovers who defy their parents. So in these works, Rousseau reinterprets major works of Western civilization on the subjects of education, sin, grace, providence, and love. He replaces them with presentations that he thinks are better than the ones given in these great books. So this is his moral revolution. By thinking so big, Rousseau managed to recruit an army of readers and fellow writers who sometimes embraced, sometimes rejected, and sometimes modified his project. Readers named their children after characters in Rousseau's novels. They moved to the country rather than lived in the city because of reading the novels. Mothers began to nurse their own children rather than send them out to wet nurses because of Rousseau's books. Among the writers influenced by Rousseau were Immanuel Kant, who called Rousseau the Newton of the moral universe for bringing intellectual order where there had only been chaos. And Leo Tolstoy, the author of War and Peace, who said that the only book that influenced him more than Rousseau's Confessions was the New Testament. To these we could add writers like Mary Shelley, who in her novel Frankenstein incorporated scenes from Rousseau's autobiographical writings and parts of his critique of the sciences. So a literary revolution takes place after Rousseau under his influence. I'm by no means an expert on music, but there are experts who insist that Rousseau's writings about music had a great effect on the composers of the next generation, particularly Beethoven. To be sure, there have certainly been critics of Rousseau from the beginning, and there are today, who claim that his influence was entirely bad. But even most of them acknowledge that it was enormous. Terrible effect, but it was a big effect. What I've just been talking about concerns the means by which Rousseau became effective, writing these books that influenced people, gave them a new perspective on the world. But I've not yet said much directly about the substance of this effect. So let me remind you that he wrote within the horizon provided by his realization that an age of revolutions was coming, and furthermore that political revolutions rarely produce good effects. He certainly did write political works that he thought could improve the odds of good effects coming. But most of these writings were directed towards small communities out of the mainstream. They aimed at allowing these communities to survive the revolution around them and help them avoid the paths that led others to their imminent disaster. He was more concerned with places like Corsica, Geneva, and Poland than with places like England and France. He urged these small and apparently backward places to go their own way and not imitate their larger and flashier neighbors. For the larger places, he attempted to bring about moral and social changes that could happen within a society of political corruptness. In order to present these changes, Rousseau wanted to bring about in order to present the changes that Rousseau wanted to bring about, I should first say something about the specific form of the corruption that he observed around him. I can put this in a slightly paradoxical way. Rousseau claims that we, modern people who live in prosperous societies, are both selfish and conformist at the same time. Our selfishness consists in the fact that although we can speak eloquently about our commitment to morality, our behavior indicates that we see other people mainly as means to our personal ends. When we network, we want people who will be useful for us. We see our relations with others in terms of how we can profit from them, how we can get other people to do what we want them to do. Other thinkers sometimes argue that our selfish concern for our own good can be educated, so that we can become aware that we can get our own good only by cooperating with others who are also seeking their own good. Rousseau is skeptical of this claim. He admits that pretending to cooperate with other people can make us successful. But he argues that while genuine cooperation sometimes works, more often manipulation and exploitation do the job better. Strangely, the manipulative and exploitative selfishness is precisely what leads to conformism. Our desire to manipulate other people so that they serve our advantage means that we have to be very concerned with our status and the way they look at us. And this means we must behave in a way that will win approval from them, rather than the way we would like to behave. In effect, Rousseau argues that modern people tend to be selfish phonies, who in the pursuit of their selfish desires constantly strive to convince others that they want what other people want of them. Ultimately, this leads them to judge their own success by what other people think of them. So they're both selfish and conformist at the same time. They want to be individuals, but they end up being the most complete non-individual conformist imaginable. Rousseau also argues this is not the inevitable human condition. This isn't simply the way human nature makes us. There have been societies, he usually mentions Sparta and the Roman Republic, in which people's attachment to the community made their lives very different and morally superior to ours. But, as I've also argued, he also thinks that going back to those days is practically impossible. We're not going to become Spartans or Romans. So what can be done? I'll mention 3 changes that Rousseau tries to promote that don't require a radical change in us, but can mitigate the corruption he observes. These involve the family, our feelings about others, and our devotion to personal independence. In order to understand the changes Rousseau wants to make in the family, we should first consider what the family was that he wanted to change. In Rome, fathers had absolute control over their households, but they were supposed to consider their family as ranking second in their affections to the Roman Republic, the community. They were patriots first, fathers second. That family is dead, and it had been dead for a long time when Rousseau was alive. What was not dead in Rousseau's day was a view of the family in the upper reaches of society that stressed that marriages should be made to cement social alliances and to facilitate moving up the ladder. Your son marries my daughter in order to make a useful bond between your family and mine, in order to produce a male heir who will guarantee the future of this particular family. It's a very transactional, business-like arrangement. The preferences of the people getting married were not very relevant to this. In fact, the result of this is easy to see: unhappy marriages, adultery, and so on. As an alternative to this sorry state of affairs, Rousseau promotes romantic love as the basis of family relations. We don't see this as a revolution because we take it for granted. But for Rousseau's contemporaries, this was seen as something radically new. His novels involve fathers who create tragedy by not letting their daughters marry as they want, and other fathers who encourage their daughters to follow their own wishes, subject to minimal parental interference. In both instances, his treatments are complex in ways that I can't really go into here. For now, I just want to note that this involves the encouragement of a certain amount of selfishness. People are devoted to their own happiness in getting married rather than to the advancement of their family. So people doing what they want without regard to their parents or perhaps even to future generations. Rousseau is well aware of this, but that he insists that romantic love is not mere selfishness, even though there are few people more self-absorbed than those who are in love. But at least they're thinking about someone else. Coupled with his promotion of romantic love, he also gives a new importance to children, not merely as potential heirs, but in themselves. By being devoted to their children's happiness, the parents also strengthen their bond to each other. In addition, they come to take an interest in the community in which their children will live. They do not put the republic first, like Roman fathers, but they contribute to it for the sake of those they love. They will become better citizens, although not perfect ones, because they are not because they're devoted to the republic above all things, but because they want what is good for their own family. Rather than simply calculating how they personally can use other people, they think about their lives in completely different terms. The important thing here is that Rousseau does not insist on people being perfectly unselfish. Instead, he tries to show how one particular form of concern for oneself can lead to broader concerns for the community. My second example is similar in that in it Rousseau tries to show that a particular selfish feeling could lead to something more than manipulation or domination. This feeling is compassion or pity. Today, we're often urged to be compassionate toward others, as if compassion is a very high moral virtue, and people who lack compassion are often regarded as vicious people. But Rousseau sees things somewhat differently. Compassion is primarily a feeling rather than a virtue. Right? We feel with someone else. Right? It involves identifying ourselves with what someone else is suffering. We feel what they feel. This is, however, painful. To observe suffering is a painful experience. That's why we often spontaneously turn our heads away at the sight of pain. Often we don't want to help, we want to get away. Rousseau argues, however, that there can also be a pleasant sweetness in this feeling. First of all, we feel relief that it is someone else who is suffering, not us. We identify with their suffering, but we also realize it's not us suffering. Secondly, when rather than running away, we actually help them, we feel our own superiority and their dependence on us. We indulge our compassion because it makes us feel good about ourselves. But in doing so, we actually help other people. Compassion can take many forms. Rousseau does not think that all of them are admirable. Moral virtue in general and justice in particular are superior to compassion. Compassion can, however, in its best forms, be a substitute for moral virtue. We do good for others while receiving a personal pleasure for doing this good. It's not completely altruistic. Rousseau encourages compassion because it's a way of enlisting our own self-regard into better relations with others. It remains a feeling rather than a virtue, but it is a feeling that does not have to lead to manipulation or domination in the way that ordinary selfishness does. My final example concerns personal independence. Remember that one of the symptoms of our current social corruption, according to Rousseau, is that selfish as we are conformists who constantly sacrifice what would make us happy to our social status. In this case, I'd like to cite a recent book that talks about Rousseau, called Liberal States, Authoritarian Families, by a scholar named Rita Koganson, who happens to have been a student of mine at one point. She makes Rousseau's point. She shows that much thinking about contemporary education today, there's a marked prejudice against the influence of parents. It's assumed that parents are narrow and prejudiced, and that the main purpose of education, particularly public education, should be to free students from the influence of their parents. In university education programs, future teachers are often taught to be suspicious of parents. In schools today, sometimes make it a principle of refusing to communicate with parents about significant aspects of their child's lives. Koganson's point, which he takes from Rousseau, is that once students are removed from parental influences, rather than becoming simply independent, they tend to look for influence elsewhere, often from fellow students. Koganson argues that far from making students independent thinkers, suspicion of parents often puts them under an immense pressure to conform to the expectations of other young people, and the sort of conformism that Rousseau complains about. Rousseau promotes a sort of education that will make young people capable of resisting the pressure of their peers. He is in fact worried about the narrowness of parents, but he is much more worried about the narrowness of general society. So these are the revolutions in our understanding that Rousseau promoted once he had come to the conclusion that political revolutions, while inevitable, were ultimately dangerous and uncertain in their results. Now, I'd like to conclude by saying something about how Rousseau studied to prepare himself for his astonishing career, which had such great effects, I argue. His method might be helpful for some of you in your own studies, even if you don't plan on becoming revolutionaries in Rousseau's sense or some other. As I said, he had almost no formal schooling, and therefore lacked teachers. He set out to learn by reading books by great thinkers. But how do you do that? When he began, he wanted to know whether the thinker he was studying was correct, right from the beginning of the book. So he would read a sentence and say, I'm going to have to read a lot of other books before I can judge that sentence. And he'd go get the other books. Unfortunately, with the first sentence of each of those books, he had to go and get other books. So he never got any place. He read a lot of first sentences, but never got to the second sentence. So he decided this method was not going to work. So he had to arrive at another method. He decided that instead of trying to decide what was true from the beginning, that he would simply try to follow the argument of the thinker to understand what he was saying. In other words, he temporarily suspended his own critical faculty or independence of thought for the sake of being able to have independence of thought later. Once he had mastered several books this way, he then started to make comparisons between them because these thinkers all disagreed with each other about important things. So he said in his spare time he would make these comparisons. Now, Rousseau is known as a writer, even by those who disagree with him profoundly, as someone who is radically independent as a thinker. This is his account of how to become a radically independent thinker. Begin by trying to understand what other thinkers are actually saying, and then make the judgments about whether they're right. I suggest this as a model for you in your studies here. Thank you very much.
We have a few minutes for questions, about a little bit over 10 minutes for some Q&A. If you have questions, please raise your hand and I'll come to you with the microphone.
I was wondering if you could say something. Much of your talk and the moral revolution he brought about was a moral revolution that takes the form in a way of advice for others. That is, the young people and the writers who are not Rousseau. Is there some aspect to his own life? I mean, I'm thinking, knowing a little bit about Rousseau, he did not commit his life to romantic love, and his feeling towards others or thoughts about the world is not limited to indulging in compassion, etc. Is there something beyond his advice to others that constituted his revolution, maybe in his own life?
Yeah. Yes, so another one of my former students who asked difficult questions. Yeah, it's certainly true that one of the things that's very conspicuous when one reads Rousseau is that many of the things he recommends for other people are not things that he did himself. He often presents these things as great misfortunes, that, you know, if he hadn't run away from Geneva when he was not quite 16 years old, he would have lived a very different life, and he often says he regrets that. If he hadn't launched into his literary career and then been persecuted, he wouldn't have had people stoning his house in the middle of the night and mobs chasing him and his books read by the public hangman and warrants issued for his arrest. And so he regards it as a mistake that he did these things. But I think you're also right that some of the ways in which Rousseau is very different from these things that he counsels for other people are things that he did choose and did regard as desirable. So I think what we see in Rousseau is something like this. Again, I'll refer to Plato's Republic, one of Rousseau's favorite books. You know, you can see in Plato's Republic that the question that's raised is what the relationship is between justice and happiness. And in the course of the Republic, that turns into the question or way of what's the relationship between philosophy and happiness, or what's the relationship between philosophy and justice, right? And these are presented in the Republic as great problems, that philosophers there are not presented as being unjust in any way, but they're not exactly what we think of ordinary, just, good citizens are like. So they choose a way of life that is justifiable because it's better than the way of life that most people are going to lead. And I think that in the case of Rousseau, there's something like that. The life that he says is best is not really so much the one of contemplating the truth that might be the official teaching of the Republic, but a sort of life that involves intellectual independence. It involves a sort of ability to imagine things that don't exist. And you know, Rousseau is a great novelist and so on. So it is a life of a sort of intellectual and personal independence which is not really available for the majority of people. But I think he regards that he had the particular disposition and talents that allowed him to pursue.
Thank you so much for that. It just brought Rousseau to life for all of us for today and in so many different ways. So thank you for that. One of the things that struck me was at the end here about compassion, and I would say that today we sometimes see compassion framed as a weakness, and to be fair, it's often presented as empathy as a weakness, and I hear you saying, I hope I hear correctly, that Rousseau would certainly not paint it as a weakness. And so I wonder if you could do that connection to us today and for us today, and talk a little bit about maybe why painting compassion as a weakness is wrong, or why compassion is itself a sort of strength.
Okay. Well, first of all, I think in some ways Rousseau does consider it to be simply a weakness, right? That if you do not, in fact, feel weaknesses in yourself, you're unable to identify with the suffering that other people experience. So in the second discourse, when talking about pity, he says the philosopher, hears someone being murdered outside his door and says, "It's not me," and rolls over and goes back to sleep. So he's not weak, right, in that, but he's also feels himself to be immune from ordinary human suffering. And Rousseau does not present an attractive picture of that. So I think we can say that Rousseau identifies, first of all, this sort of raw feeling of identification, which he says animals experience as well. They're horrified when they see another animal of the same species suffering. What that means is they're afraid. Essentially, they're afraid. It's not that they're going to rush and try to help them. They're going to run away because there's danger here. So it is rooted in a weakness. And this is the advantage, I think, in Rousseau's account. But he does think that it can be developed in such a way that it can accompany certain sorts of strengths. So when I said that the sweetness of the experience of compassion is based first of all, on the relief that you feel that you're not suffering, and that is an awareness of your own strength. I could be suffering, but I'm not. Secondly, that when you act compassionately, you feel your own strength. You feel yourself as doing something that someone else needs and should be grateful for. So there is you could say, the primitive root experience, it's just pure terror that makes you want to run away at the sight of suffering. But it can be developed and accompany a certain sort of strength that then makes it effective, right? And that the big thing is, why is it pleasant to experience this? And Rousseau discusses this. You go to the theater and you see the just person suffering, unjustly, and terrible things are happening to them, and you start crying, and then you leave, and then the next day you go and subject yourself to this again. Why do you want to do this? Right? And it's got to be that there's some element in doing it. You can pat yourself on the back for your sensitivity and appreciation of other people. And I think Rousseau does not regard this cynically. Right? He really thinks that there is a powerful experience of your own strength in recognizing the weakness of other people and wanting to help them. That's as far, I mean, I could go on forever on this subject, but that's as far as I'll go here.
Could it be argued that Rousseau was opposed to cohesion in the sense that individuality is lost? So would cohesion only be beneficial if individuals are aware of who they are?
No, it's a very good question. For this reason, one of the points that Tom Cleveland was getting at earlier is that you see in Rousseau both a great praise of citizenship, that people who were great citizens in the past that we don't see anymore. So the first Brutus, the Roman citizen who sentences his own sons to death because they are conspiring to overthrow the republic and restore the monarchy. What a horrifying thing. And St. Augustine said, well, that's terrible. Rousseau says that's admirable that a father would do that for the sake of justice, that he loves justice more than he loves his own sons. So Rousseau is a great proponent of citizenship, which involves seeing your identity in terms of the community as a whole. But on the other hand, Rousseau is also a great proponent of being a real individual, not being a slavish conformist, right? So we see both of these things, and I think Rousseau's claim is something like this. If you look at us, we're neither of those. One of my teachers once put it this way, that Rousseau says, when we look at other people, we think about ourselves. And when we think about ourselves, we think about what other people think about us, right? So we're never entirely thinking about other people, which is what a real citizen does. And we're never really entirely thinking about ourselves because we're always seeing ourselves in terms of the way other people view us. And Rousseau tries at different points in his thought to push us in one direction or the other. We're divided and contradictory. Either of these others are neither divided nor contradictory. I mean, ultimately, I think that you're both right in suggesting if we look at Rousseau himself, he leads a very unconventional, personal, idiosyncratic existence. And that seems to be what he, since he chose it for himself, that would seem to be the better of the two options that are better than the way he saw people living around him. But both of them are better. Well, I'll leave it at that.
Last question here.
Thank you for the presentation. I want to shift topics. Earlier in your presentation, you were talking about the idea of a society that focuses on being brilliant and transitory is one that is almost on the cusp of revolution. And I think we can see, at least in the last century, maybe the last half century, that there has been significant moral degradation, at least in Western society. Society seems to be more focused on this brilliant aspect of itself rather than something that's more virtuous. Do you think that, given current political situations in both the United States and Europe at large, do you think Rousseau again would predict that there is going to be some sort of revolution, maybe not in the extreme sense of like a French Revolution style, but is revolution on the horizon for the Western world?
I think Rousseau would say yes. You know, and I'll end with this story. I gave some lectures on Rousseau in China, and there was a question session like this after one of the lectures, and one of the students raised his hand and said, "What would Rousseau say you should do if you live in a totalitarian community which is completely unjust?" And I thought, you know, there are people who are going to inform the government about him asking this question and what I say and how he responds to it. So I gave an answer to it, but suggested that we meet afterwards and have a talk someplace farther away. And in that, you know, in Rousseau's answer to that sort of question is that the most important thing in those circumstances, if you recognize that there is a genuine possibility for change, you have to do it. On the other hand, what you have to do is learn how to live your life so that you're not dominated by other people, and even more importantly, that you don't have to spend your time trying to dominate them for your own ends. And he's optimistic enough to think that human circumstances are such that you can always be more or less successful in that goal, even if you can't politically. So yeah, I do think that the things that you say about the contemporary situation would strike Rousseau. You know, Paris before the revolution was a very glamorous place in a way that our lives aren't glamorous, although for very few people. Those people happened to be interested in inviting Rousseau to their parties, so he saw them. So you could say that our lives aren't quite so brilliant as pre-revolutionary Paris, although it is true that Rousseau saw that brilliance as being a reflection of a desire for luxury that allowed you to say you possess things that other people don't. And I think we can understand that phenomenon perfectly well.
Thank you, Dr. Coe.